Okay, we're just going to wait for a couple of minutes until others would also join the meeting. And okay, so today is going to be a very exciting session. We are going to start a very challenging series of book reading. This is a particular challenging topic called active inference. And the godfather of active inference, who has used this idea to how the brain works, how we can model perception, how we can model planning, decision making in the brain, is Professor Carl Frisson, who has uh, applied all of these methods and developed different versions of it in order to explain how we do all of these things in the brain. And the problem with the problem usually is with most people, especially from machine learning background, who want to get started with this book. Unfortunately, the math is too heavy. And I was thinking maybe because I've been going through this book for a very long time now, and as well as the ideas behind active inference and the free energy principle, I thought that maybe it's a good idea to start a reading session at ML Dawn, where we'll go over different chapters of the book, page by page, and we have a discussion. You guys can ask your questions. And the good news is, this book, actually, this is the book by three authors, Thomas Parr, Giovanni Pezzulo, and Carl J. Frisson. Active Inference, the Free Energy Principle in Mind, Brain, and Behavior. This book is also available for free. I found it very interesting that it was available for free. I'm just gonna show you where to find it. It's been published by MIT Press. So let me just share my screen. Okay. So this is the book. So it's the MIT Press website. So if you go there, you actually see that, okay, you can actually buy this hardcover, but at the same time, the free version is available. Let me see. Yeah, so if you read open access, if you click on that, you'll have access to all of the chapters. But to be honest, I had to buy it because I'm more comfortable with reading things, physically having the book in my hand. It has a far more, enjoyable feeling to it. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to get started with the very first chapter, well, the second chapter basically. So we're just going to skip the intro and we're just going to get started with the second chapter, which is the technical part, and this is where everything gets started. Of course, you do have the option to go to the website that I showed you and just, read the preface, the overview, the introduction. It is interesting, I have to say, it is interesting, but it's just not the material for us to actually go over in a live session. It's not really necessary to go over it together. It's easily understandable and really enjoyable to read as well. So it's going to be a short session, by the way, because this is the first session and I just don't want to go too hard in our first session. So it's called The Low Road to Active Inference, and it starts with a very nice quote from William James. My thinking is first and last and always for the sake of my doing. Before we get started, I just want to give you a very brief introduction as to what you're going to be observing here. As you've seen in the title of today's session, it's about perception. And the way it's been phrased in the book is perception as inference, right? So before we get into the details of this, let me just give you a brief intro about what perception is from a Bayesian perspective, from a Bayesian statistics perspective. For many years, this idea was popular that our brain is this statistical unit that has the ability to infer the hidden causes and explanations for the sensory input that it's receiving from the world around it. Because remember, our brain, as magnificent as it is trapped in a dark room that is your skull. Just think about it for a second. It's just so unsettling to think about it. Like, it's literally in pitch black, pure darkness. But at the same time, we have this ability to, we see the environment around us, we hear things, we can touch things, we feel things, and we can analyze, we can even predict the future. So our brain has this ability to look into the future and predict things, right? Even plan things, and even send commands to the motory components of your being, like your limbs, for example, to actually apply action upon the world, which will actually change the world around you. And if the world is changed, the sensory input that you're going to receive is going to change as well, right? So if the room is dark, and let's say you prefer a bright room where you can see everything around you, the brain would send the command, okay, flip the light switch, and you turn it on, and all of a sudden the sensory input changes, right? All of a sudden you're receiving the sensory input coming in, the illumination, right? So the brain has this ability to change the environment such that the sensory input that it receives are more aligned with its preference, or with my preference. Remember, the idea of I, like, it can get really philosophical. Now, where does perception come into play? You are receiving all of these sensory inputs. Right now, you're looking at me, you're seeing me, these waves of light are sort of getting off your screen, getting to your eyes, into your sensorium, and you're hearing my voice at the same time. You're touching your keyboard, you're feeling the buttons, the keys under your fingers. All of these signals are being sent to the brain in a pure dark room. Perception means that the brain has this ability to say, I'm getting all of these sensations. What could be the cause behind these sensations? What can actually explain the thing that I'm receiving right now? For example, now the light that is going through your eyes and to the visual cortex of your brain and being analyzed, your brain perceives it as Mehran from ML presenting something to me right now, right? So you don't think that one of your relatives in front of you. You don't feel like you're actually talking to a physical human being in front of you. You know perfectly well that you're sitting in front of your screen, in front of your cell phone. How do you know this? That's the thing. That is perception. To you and I, it's really clear. But if you think about it, it's really magnificent that the brain can infer the causes behind the sensory data that it receives from the environment. It's just magnificent. So with that introduction, let's just get into the book. We're just going to go maybe over first page and half of the second page, because after that, it's going to get into the math. Surprise, surprise. Right after that, we're going to get into the math. So let's just get started. Introduction. This chapter introduces active inference by starting from the Helmholtzian, or perhaps Kantian, view of perception as conscious inference. So this dates back to 1867. This is really an old idea. And related ideas that have emerged more recently under the Bayesian brain hypothesis. So this idea of perception as unconscious inference, we are unconsciously inferring what's the hidden cause behind our sensory data. This idea nowadays is being talked about as Bayesian brain, right? Some people also talk about it as a unifying brain theory that finally explains how the brain learns, how the brain operates. But anyway, you might also think about, like, maybe wonder what active inference means. This is the main idea of this book, by the way. But just to give you a very, very, very short description of what that means is that you are actively inferring what to do next, the action that you're going to release upon the world, like what you're actually going to do physically. You're actively inferring what to do. And the way you do it, there's a reason behind why you do things, right? So you want to achieve something. From the free energy principles perspective, that can be explained really well, actually. But I don't want to get into the detail of it. But it just means you're actively inferring what to do next based on some preferences, based on something that you'd like to happen. Let's just keep it at that for now, okay? Now, we talked about Bayesian brain hypothesis. It explains how active inference subsumes and extends these ideas by treating not just perception, but also action, planning, and learning as problems of Bayesian inference, and by deriving a principled variational approximation to such otherwise intractable problems. So there are big words there, right? I mean, I get it, like you might be confused about what the hell is happening. So many big words here. And if you're confused, very rightfully so. The first time I read this, I was like, what are you talking about? But this is very interesting. So active inference, right? It explains how so the idea of Bayesian brain explains how active inference subsumes and extends these ideas by treating not just perception, but also action. That's what I told you, right? Active inference is about knowing, inferring what to do next. Planning, so you're not actually doing anything, you're just sitting there, and the Bayesian model in your brain is sort of unfolding into the future to sort of estimate, if I did this and did that and then did that and did that, this will happen. How can you do it? That's the idea. That's amazing. So that's called planning. And learning as problems of Bayesian inference. So the idea behind this is that this whole idea of active inference, we are doing all sorts of inferences, whether we are inferring the hidden causes behind our sensory input data, that is perception, or we are inferring what to do, or what sort of policy of actions to follow in the future as planning. You're not actually deciding what to do now, but you're thinking about a sequence of actions into the future, and you're sort of contemplating the consequences related to that, right? So that is why we call it inference, and specifically it's a Bayesian inference problem. So I hope that you're familiar with Bayes' theorem. We will go over this, don't worry, but this is just a general idea. So Bayesian inference, and by deriving a principled approximation to such otherwise intractable problems. So we will see actually that using Bayes' theorem, which is this optimal, like universal method of updating beliefs about the world, about the actions you want to choose, Bayesian inference is fantastic, but you will see that it is actually intractable to precisely infer what's the hidden cause behind my sensory data, or what action should I take in the next 2 seconds. It is intractable to exactly compute that. The probability of most likely action, the probability of most likely explanation behind my sensory data. It is intractable. And that is why here the authors talk about deriving a principled approximation to such otherwise intractable problems, right? And you might also wonder, what does variational mean here? Again, so many big words. Variational simply goes into the math of this. It sort of talks about variational calculus that is needed if you want to really understand how the math works when it comes to perception and active inference. Just to give you a very, 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 very big picture about what variational means, when you are dealing with variational calculus, suppose you want to optimize a function. So, for example, in artificial neural networks, it's very straightforward. You use gradient descent as your optimization algorithm. You have this loss function. You compute the gradient of the loss with respect to each parameter of the neural network, right? Each one of the synaptic weights. When it comes to variational calculus, variational approach to optimization, you are not optimizing with respect to a scalar, like to one given variable, like a weight. You are approximating with respect to an entire function, right? That is what it means when we say variational. You optimize something variationally. It means you're optimizing with respect to an entire function. And why we are approximating? Because exact inference using Bayes theorem in real-world situation is absolutely intractable. Okay? But we're going to talk about this. So this is just a very, very general introduction. Okay? Don't worry. We'll go over all of these things. We'll actually have a very nice numeric example with Bayes theorem and how perception works here. So no worries here. Don't worry. Now, let's get started with perception as inference. There's a long tradition of seeing the brain as a predictive machine, or a statistical organ that infers and predicts external states of the world. Right? So external states, so that connects to the idea of different things, different states around you, outside your brain and the world, that is beyond that innate darkness in your skull, right? So the brain is sort of thought about as a predictive machine that can make inferences about the states of the world, right? So for example, by state I mean, is my world now dangerous or not? Am I at risk or not? Is the world bright or dark? Is it wet? Is the music that I'm hearing is there a piano there? Is someone playing the piano, for example, or playing the violin, right? So all of these different things that you can experience around yourself in the world, that can be inferred or talked about as the external states in the world. Remember these words are critical. External states. That means they are beyond my head, beyond the brain, that the brain can't see. Whenever you hear internal states, that means everything inside the brain, all the synaptic weights, all the connections, all the little networks that neurons make together, all the concentrations of neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, everything that is going on in a dynamical way in your brain, all different things that can happen, they can be thought of as internal states. And the internal states in the brain and the external states outside in the world are separated by something that we call a Markov blanket. But we're going to get into that later, okay? Now, this idea dates back to the notion of perception as unconscious inference, Helmholtz, 1866. More recently, this has been reformulated as the Bayesian brain hypothesis. From this perspective, perception is not a purely bottom-up transduction of sensory states, for example, from the retina, into internal representations of what is out there, for example, as patterns of neuronal activity. Rather, it is an inferential process. That's the idea. Inferential process that combines top-down prior information about the most likely causes of sensations with bottom-up sensory stimuli. Bottom-up, it means that from the outside in the world, the more shallower layers that are outside from the world, like for example, layer 1 of the neural network, if you want to think about it in machine learning terms. The bottom-up means the sensory input that you're going to get from the very outer layer. Up means deep in the brain, the bottom-up sensory input, right? So let me read this again. It is an inferential process that combines top-down prior information. So the top-down, which means that what the deeper layers in your neural network and in your brain think about what's happening in more shallower layers, more shallow, until you get outside the bloody head, and the brain starts thinking about what's happening outside in the world, right? So prior information, that's what it means. The deeper layers have some prior information or understanding about what's happening in more shallow layers, and this can be pushed all the way to outside the skull and in the world, right? But how can they make these prior beliefs more informative, more accurate? So that is learning. That's literally learning. By what? By the bottom-up sensory stimuli, right? So sensory data comes in, and the deeper layers, update their beliefs about what's happening in shallower layer, right? Until eventually updating the belief about what's outside in the world, right? Yeah, don't worry, Nova. We're actually recording this, so just enjoy, just listen. Have a cup of coffee and relax. Unfortunately, I forgot to have my coffee today, so I'm just going to continue. All right. So, inferential processes operate on probabilistic representations of states of the world and follow Bayes' rule, which prescribes the optimal update in the light of sensory evidence. If you think about Bayes' rule, all it does is, I don't want to get into the math of this, okay? But all it does is, you have some prior belief about some hidden, remember, hidden variable, some hidden explanation, something hidden, like it could be the way you talk about hidden layers in neural networks, that's exactly the same concept, by the way. The hidden layer in variation autoencoder, again, that's the same idea. Bayes' rule helps us fine-tune and update our beliefs about some hidden variable that we don't see using the observations that we receive from the world. So given my observation, how much am I going to change my belief about the world? So constantly, given the observation, what am I thinking? Again, the next observation comes in. Given the observation, what am I thinking? Right? So that idea of given an observation, what am I thinking? That's actually called a posterior probability distribution that can be modeled as a probability distribution, a conditional probability distribution, and because it's post having seen the data, it's called the posterior probability, right? Bayes' rule allows you to get better and better in estimating that posterior probability, right? Given the prior belief that you have. The prior belief that you have is literally has nothing to do at the very beginning, especially with the data that you're receiving. Right off the bat, you have some belief about something, right? Yeah, so you believe that in general, sending papers to A-star conferences will result in a failure, right? So you will get rejected, right? Let's say you have a very pessimistic view about this. And then you submit and you get accepted. So that's the new data that you're receiving, and it updates your prior belief about acceptance rate of A-star conferences, and it becomes a posterior probability. That is my belief about acceptance rate of A-star conferences, given the fact that my data says I got accepted. It's going to change a little bit, right? So this new belief becomes the prior for the next posterior estimation. And the next posterior estimation becomes the prior for the next posterior estimation. This conversion, this relationship between a prior belief before having seen the data and transferring this into posterior belief after having seen the data, that transition happens using Bayes' rule. And we'll see how it happens, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. Now, perception is not a passive outside-in process in which information is extracted from impressions on our sensory epithelia from out there, right? It is a constructive inside-out process in which sensations are used to confirm or disconfirm hypotheses about how they were generated. In other words, the reason behind them, right? So by hypothesis, it's simply what it means is you have this probability distribution about your belief about some external state in the world, right? That's a hypothesis, that probability distribution. Assume just a Gaussian distribution, for example. That's a hypothesis you have with a certain mean and certain standard deviation. Changing your belief about the world means the mean can change and the standard deviation can change, right? It all happens given the data, given the observation. Now here we're going to be talking about a little bit of math behind Bayes' rule. A little bit of math, okay? And then we'll jump into an actual example. But we're just gonna read this chunk, right? And that will be the discussion for today's session. And then I'll be waiting for you guys if you have any questions. But let's just get a little deeper into Bayes' rule. In turn, performing Bayesian inference requires a generative model, sometimes referred to as a forward model. So what is a generative model? Mehran, you never even mentioned the idea of a generative model. What is it? Okay. A generative model is a construct from statistical theory that generates predictions about observations. So that's why it's called a generative model. So it can actually make predictions about observations. It may be formulated as the joint probability P of y and x. It's very simple, don't worry, it's actually very simple. Of observations y and the world's hidden state x, so the joint distribution between the observations and whatever the hell is out there, right? That generate these observations, right? So the hidden states in the world are generating these observations that I'm seeing. Remember, I don't see the hidden states. They're beyond the dark room, right? But those hidden states are generating the data that the brain is receiving, right? When we talk about a generative model about in the world, we're saying that we need it if we want to be able to do Bayesian inference, compute the posterior probability. We need a generative model, and that is nothing but a joint probability distribution between the sensory input, the observations, and the hidden states X in the world that are actually generating those sensory input, those data, right? The latter are referred to as hidden or latent states. So we're talking about X, right? They're called hidden or latent states as they cannot be observed directly, right? This joint probability can be decomposed into two parts. So mathematically, you can actually define a joint probability into two subcomponents, right? So this is just basic statistics right now. So probability of X and Y can be actually calculated as probability of Y given X times probability of X, right? And if Y and X are independent, it simply becomes even simpler. It becomes probability of Y times probability of X. So you don't need to condition over X anymore, right? But in this case, that conditionality is there, right? So if you want to break this generative model into the two components, one is probability of X, the other one is probability of Y given X. So if you multiply these two together, you get probability of Y and X, the joint distribution or the generative model. Let's see what they are. The first is a prior called the prior probability P of X, which denotes the organism's knowledge to the organism, me, like a human or an animal or whatever that is alive that and can think. It denotes the organism's knowledge about the hidden states of the world prior to seeing sensory data, right? That's why it's called prior. The second is the likelihood. So it's called likelihood. That is denoted as probability of Y given X, right? So if the hidden state of the world was this, how likely is it that I'm seeing this particular sensory input, right? If, for example, Mehran is talking to me now, how likely is it that I'm hearing the sound waves that I'm hearing? That's pretty high. But if Barack Obama was sitting in front of me, how likely was it for me to actually hear what I'm hearing now? So that's very unlikely, right? So that's likelihood. It's like, how likely is it for this particular value for the hidden state to generate the sensory input data that I'm receiving right now? That's why it's called likelihood, the likelihood of this happening, right? Bayes' rule tells us how to combine these two elements, right? Essentially updating a prior probability Px into a posterior probability of hidden states after receiving the observation. So that's called P of X given Y, right? Remember, this is a posterior probability. This is the probability of the hidden state, the hidden variable, given the observations that I'm having now. But likelihood is exactly inverse of it. Probability of observing the data that I'm observing now, given if the state of the world was this, or if the state was that, or whatever other state that you might think of, right? And an observant listener would actually realize that, okay, how can you possibly think about all bloody possible hidden states in the world around you? And that's a very perceptive observation. And that is exactly why you will see very soon that you cannot compute posterior probability exactly. It's intractable because you can't account for everything. And that is why the idea of approximation comes into play. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. Now, for readers who need a brief refresher on basic probability theory, Box 2.1 provides a summary. So yeah, we have here some explanation about some mathematical, rules for anybody who wants to get, refresh themselves with these mathematical ideas. It's pretty basic, actually, but if you've forgotten, that's absolutely fine. So this one says that, like, for a given variable x, the sum of the probabilities of all possible values of x will have to be 1. This one formulates the idea of a joint probability distribution can be written as the multiplication of a conditional probability of y given x times the probability of x. And this one here talks about the product rule. So probably it's not a good idea for me to get into this right now, but this is just simply giving you an idea that if you had a joint distribution, how can you marginalize one of the variables out and just end up with probability of one of them, right? That's the idea. So, I mean, just mathematically, if you want to do that, you'll sum the joint distribution across all possible values of that variable that you want to marginalize out, right? And this turns into the joint distribution according to this rule. You just replace it with this, right? And then you notice that P of y has no dependency on x, right? So that jumps out of the sum, because sum is with respect to x, right? You end up with the sum of a probability distribution. It's a conditional probability distribution, but it is a probability distribution. So if you want to sum over all possible values of x, given a value for y could have a given, you could assume a given value for it. For a given value of y, if you want to sum all the probabilities for all possible values of x, of course, according to probabilities rule, that becomes 1. And that is why 1 times P of y becomes simply P of y. So what's the short message? The message is, when you have a joint distribution, you can turn that into a marginal distribution over one of the variables of your choice. And the way to do that, you sum the joint distribution with respect to the variable you want to marginalize out, right? Again, and finally, when you talk about a joint distribution, Of course, you can write it in two ways. So one is, so it depends on how you want to condition things. So you can say if y is conditioned over x, so probability of y given x times the probability of x, or you can go the other way around. So probability of x given y times the probability of y, right? So this lets us translate between a prior and conditional distribution likelihood and the associated marginal and the other conditional distributions, that is posterior probability. Put simply, Bayes' rule just says that the probability of two things is the probability of the first given the second times the probability of the second, which is the same as the probability of the second given the first times the probability of the first. So it literally talks about two different ways of formulating this, right? But again, this is not fully Bayes' rule. Okay, there's a little bit missing here that makes the whole thing a big nightmare. Makes the whole, I mean, there's one little component here. I don't want to get into it now, but that if you want to write down the Bayes' rule, if anybody knows the answer, please just write in the chat. But there's one component to Bayes' rule that you cannot compute exactly, and that's why, as a result of that intractability, computing posterior probability exactly will become intractable. So you have to resort to other techniques like variational inference. And now you might understand better why they're called variational. Because, as I said, the posterior probability is not tractable. So the probability of hidden state X given my observation Y is not exactly tractable, right? And we want to approximate it because it's intractable. So why do I call this approximation a variational approximation? Remember, because the thing you want to estimate is an actual function. It's a probability distribution. So you have to assume a dummy function, a Gaussian, for example, and then say that I'm going to approximate my unknown posterior by optimizing with respect to this particular function, this dummy function. Because you're optimizing with respect to a function, that becomes a variational task. That becomes a variational optimization. And that's why they call the methods, this particular method of inference, variational inference. And that's when the whole door to variational calculus comes into play. Now, anybody knows the component of Bayes' theorem that makes computing posterior probability intractable? I'm curious. If anybody knows, just write it in the chat. Otherwise, I'm just gonna spill the beans. But while we're waiting for people to write their questions, comments, or answers, I'm just gonna stop here, over here. The next session of reading this book, we'll actually start reading about an example with actual values for these probabilities and an actual, like, visual, very nice sort of explanation. Like what does prior mean? What does posterior mean? What does updating mean? What does likelihood mean? And why is it called a generative model, the joint distribution? We'll have a numerical example for this. All right, so that's about it for today. It was a short session, but yeah, it was just an intro, really. Okay, so I don't see any answer in the chat, so I'm just gonna say it. The component that gives us all the nightmare is called the evidence, and that is probability of data. That the data that I'm receiving right now, the probability of that. And why is that difficult to compute? Because you have to marginalize out all possible hidden causes in the world, everything. So mathematically, it turns into, those of you who are familiar with programming, it turns into an infinite sort of nested for loop. Like you have integration of integration of integration of integration of integration of, keeps going. Or in discrete space, you have nested sigmas, nested sums. So that is that is how you can marginalize all possible hidden causes across all of their possible values. To simply answer, what's the probability of the data that I'm receiving now? That's why it is intractable, actually. Because that becomes intractable, the actual posterior probability will become intractable to compute. So what did we say today? Just a very quick summary. We said that this idea of Bayesian brain is very popular. It dates back to the idea of unconscious inference to Helmholtz's time, 1820 something, I think. It was around that time. And the idea is that we are formulating perception as an inference problem. And the way we do that is using Bayes' rule to be able to formulate it as such a problem and to be able to make inferences about our world, about the hidden causes behind our sensory data. And we said that this is the definition of perception, and as far as the Bayes, the Bayesian mind or the Bayesian brain is concerned. And we also talked about the idea of active inference, which is the, again, as a reminder, it is the title of the book. Active Inference, it is the title of the book. We said that this is a different type of inference where we are inferring the actions that we need to take to conduct ourselves in the world and come up with policies of optimal sequences of actions to interact with the world around us. And the final bit is, remember, our brain is just an organ, an amazing organ that is trapped in pure darkness, and it needs to infer things about the world. Okay, that was it from me. If there is no questions or comments, I'm just gonna close the session for today. I'm just gonna wait for maybe 10 seconds. Okay, great. Thank you very much for being with me today, and see you in the next one. Bye.